Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Gregory Wilpert, coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. Both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate overwhelmingly voted to override President Obama's veto of the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act on Wednesday. This was the first time Congress overrode a veto by President Obama. The act, which is also known by its acronym JASTA, allows U.S. citizens to sue foreign governments for their involvement in terrorist acts on U.S. soil. The bill's main beneficiaries are intended to be the families of victims of the 9/11 terror attacks, and the main target is generally considered to be the government of Saudi Arabia. In a town hall-style discussion on CNN, President Obama explained why he opposed the bill.
The problem with that is that if we eliminate this notion of sovereign immunity, then our men and women in uniform around the world could potentially start seeing ourselves subject to reciprocal laws. And the concern that I've had has nothing to do with Saudi Arabia per se or my sympathy for 9/11 families. It has to do with me not wanting a situation in which we're suddenly exposed to liabilities for all the work that we're doing all around the world.
Shortly after the veto was overridden, a number of Republicans expressed regret for having supported the bill, saying that they were not clear about what it implied and how the congressional leadership, and now the congressional leadership, has signaled a willingness to revise the bill. Joining us to take a closer look at Obama's argument against the bill and what it implies is John Quigley. He is Professor Emeritus of International Law at Ohio State University and has written extensively about both the Middle East and Russia. His books include The Ruses of War, American Interventionism Since World War II. Thanks for being on The Real News, John.
Thank you.
So, as we saw in the excerpt from Obama's town hall, his main argument for opposing JASTA is that he says it eliminates the principle of into us what this principle is all about.
Sovereign immunity is a principle that has existed in the law for centuries that says that a state cannot be sued in the domestic courts of another state. So, for example, Canada can't be sued in a court in Massachusetts, and that's a principle that states have adhered to for a very long time, on the theory that anything involving a state should be handled at the diplomatic level. That principle has been eroded to some extent in the 20th century and into the 21st century. First, by virtue of the fact that some states began to engage in commercial activity through state-owned companies, and it was thought that they shouldn't be immune from suit, for failing to sell a product properly or failing to pay for a product. So there was erosion of the principle to that extent, and also for what are considered torts, that is, what you might call product liability suits, where a state that is engaging in a commercial activity that involves selling some product sells a defective product. So you had those exceptions coming in. Then in the late 20th century, the United States added a different exception. The ones I've been mentioning, the ones relating to commercial activity and to torts, were accepted generally around the world. But then the United States added a new one for what it called state sponsors of terrorism. That is, that certain states could be sued for acts involving terrorism. And the State Department then began to put out a list of states, and there are currently, I think, 3 states on this: Syria, Sudan, and Iran, can be sued in the United States for acts of terrorism committed anywhere in the world. The new legislation that was just adopted over President Obama's veto is a further expansion, and it would allow suit against any state if that state promotes a terrorist act that occurs in the territory of the United States. So that's the significance of the new piece of legislation. And the impetus to it was that some victims of the 9/11 attacks have been trying to sue the government of Saudi Arabia. So that's likely to be the most immediate impact of it. But the legislation is more inclusive than that. The legislation does not name Saudi Arabia. It says that a suit can be maintained against any foreign state that promotes a terrorist act that is carried out within the United States.
So it sounds like this this law, the JASTA Act, would significantly erode, indeed, the principle of sovereign immunity. Would you say that's true? And if so, do you think that's a problem for international law more generally?
Well, it is a significant erosion, and it does open up the possibility that other governments will follow a similar path and will allow more suits against foreign states, including the United States. Now, in a way, you could say, well, that's good. States do bad things. They should be sued. There are problems with that, however. One can't really count on courts to be impartial when they're dealing with an act of a foreign government. Political considerations come to play, and so a state that is generally disfavored may not do so well, whereas a state that is an ally might do better. So that would be one problem.
I guess one could say that. The concern that Obama mentioned about the U.S. being sued could be an indicator that the U.S. Is actually perhaps potentially guilty of something. What do you make of that argument? That for example, the U.S. has carried out a number of drone attacks that have killed civilians, and that could try to sue the U.S. in return. Wouldn't that be something positive? And wouldn't and if not, what would be the alternative course of action for somebody who's a victim? I mean.
Yes, I think that is what President Obama is probably immediately concerned about, that the United States carries out actions of that sort, drone attacks or missile attacks, and that there are victims of those attacks. And this would open the way to suit in a foreign state. There was this one incident not too long ago where the United States, I think it was in Syria, carried out a missile attack to try to free a couple of hostages and wound up killing two of them. And one of them was an Italian, and the United States paid something like $1 million to his family as a compensation payment, and made clear in the documentation that it sent when it did that it was not opening itself up to suit in the courts of Italy. I think there was concern that the United States could have been sued over that. But your point is that this may be a good thing to allow suits against states that engage in that kind of activity. And that may well be, because there aren't very many avenues of redress for someone who is harmed by a government, unless the state of nationality of that person takes it up and makes a diplomatic case out of it. That person is not likely to have any direct form of redress.
What about the other courts? I mean, after all, we also have the International Criminal Court of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. One being more responsible for acts of individuals, and the other being responsible for the acts of states. Wouldn't those be a form of recourse for victims of violators of individual law? Of international law and also of human rights abuses?
Yes, potentially they can be. The International Court of Justice could be such a forum that would, as I say, require that the state of nationality of the victim take up the matter. That is, the individual does not have direct recourse to the International Court of Justice. So that would be the limitation. And then as well, the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice is limited in ways that mean that not all cases can be brought there. So that's a potential source, but there are limitations. The International Criminal Court, as you say, is another possibility, but that requires characterizing the activity as a crime committed by a particular person. So the action would be against a particular person, and it would be possible to get damages, but it would be a damage award against that individual person, not against a foreign government.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be somewhat limiting, especially if you consider that the U.S. has so far refused to participate to a large extent in both of those courts, right?
Yes. So I think realistically, neither one of those courts is going to be a practical source of remedy in most situations.
Okay. Well, we've reached the end of our time, but thanks so much, John, for agreeing to this interview. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.